Nobody in that dining room expected the housekeeper to speak. But when Claudette Marsh finally opened her mouth, the woman who had spent 2 years trying to erase her went completely still. It started the way most terrible things start in houses like the Alderton estate, quietly, with a closed door and a polite excuse. Claudette Marsh had worked for the Alderton family for 11 years. She had ironed the shirts that went to board meetings. She had changed the sheets in the guest rooms before funerals, before birthdays, before the long weekends when the family arrived from the city, smelling of expensive perfume and something like relief. She had learned which son took 2 sugars, and which one wanted his coffee black and left on the side table without being spoken to. She had learned which rooms held grief and which rooms held secrets, and she had learned, because a woman in her position always learns, when to move quietly and when to disappear entirely. She had never once raised her voice inside those walls, until the Sunday that Brigitte Voss walked into the kitchen and told her she was no longer needed. Not fired. That word was too plain for Brigitte Voss. She said no longer needed, the way someone sets a cracked vase outside for the garbage and tells themselves they are not throwing it away. They are simply making room. Claudette had been polishing the silver when Brigitte came in. Not because anyone had asked. Because it was the 3rd Sunday of the month, and that was what she did on the 3rd Sunday of the month. 11 years of 3rd Sundays. The silver was warm in her hands, the cloth moving in slow familiar circles, when the door swung open, and Brigitte Voss crossed the kitchen floor in heels that had no business being worn indoors. She was wearing white. She always wore white in the Alderton house, as if she had already decided it belonged to her. Claudette. Not a greeting, a transaction. Claudette set the silver down and turned. She did not say anything because she had learned long ago that waiting cost her nothing, and Brigitte Voss always needed to be the one to arrive at the point. Theodore and I have been talking. Brigitte smoothed one hand along the counter as she said it, not looking at what she was touching, the way people touch things they plan to own. We feel the household is overstaffed for what it actually requires these days. The children are grown. The estate really only needs a cleaning service twice a week. Someone who comes in, does what's needed and goes. She paused. That pause was deliberate. Claudette had met enough women like Brigitte Voss to know that the pause was the part that was supposed to do the work. The part where the other person filled in the silence with apology or agreement, whichever came faster. Claudette did neither. Brigitte continued. Your tenure here has been very long, and I want you to know that the family appreciates that. Theodore especially. But circumstances change. She tilted her head just slightly, and the diamond at her ear caught the kitchen light. We'd like to give you until the end of the month. 2 weeks, 11 years, 2 weeks. Claudette picked up the silver cloth again. Her hands were very still. Does Mr. Alderton know you're having this conversation with me? Something crossed Brigitte Voss's face. It was not guilt. It was closer to irritation at the question itself, at being asked to account for something she had not expected to account for. Theodore and I discuss everything, she said. That was not an answer. Claudette recognized that too. Then I'll wait to hear it from him directly, Claudette said. Her voice was even. She did not raise it, did not sharpen it. She simply said the words the way someone says a fact. The sky is gray today, it may rain by afternoon, I will wait to hear it from him directly. Brigitte blinked. She had not expected that. People like Brigitte Voss are not accustomed to the word wait coming from the direction they'd decided was beneath them. She straightened, her chin lifted a precise degree. That won't be necessary. It will for me, Claudette said. The kitchen went quiet. The refrigerator hummed. Somewhere deeper in the house, a clock marked the half hour. Brigitte Voss looked at Claudette Marsh, the way a person looks at something they believed was already settled, and are now annoyed to discover is still standing there, taking up space, having opinions. I beg your pardon? I've worked in this house for 11 years, Claudette said. She kept her hands moving, slow circles, the silver coming clean beneath the cloth. I was here before you were, Brigitte. I'll hear about my own position from Arthur or from Theodore. Not from you. The name came out the way it was meant to, not Mr. Alderton's fiancée, not Miss Voss, just the first name, plain as water. And it landed exactly as hard as Claudette intended. Brigitte's mouth tightened. She was not accustomed to being Brigitte in this house. Behind her, from the hallway, came the sound of footsteps. The measured, familiar sound of someone who moved through this house, like it remembered the shape of him, because it did. Arthur Alderton appeared in the kitchen doorway. He was 71 years old, and he carried it the way certain men carry age, not as a diminishment but as an accumulation. His hair had gone fully white years ago. His hands showed his decades in them, the knuckles enlarged, the veins prominent, but his back was straight and his eyes were the same dark, observant gray they had always been. He was still in his Sunday clothes, a cardigan the color of old wood, trousers pressed with the precision Claudette had maintained for a decade. He looked at Brigitte first, then at Claudette, then at the silver in Claudette's hands. What's happening here? He asked. The question was mild. Arthur Alderton had always asked questions mildly. It was Claudette had understood early on, a kind of discipline. A man who did not need to shout to be heard had learned something most people never did. Brigitte turned to him immediately, and her face changed the way faces change when the audience they actually want has arrived. The irritation softened. Her voice lowered into something warmer, something almost wounded. I was just speaking with Claudette about the household restructuring we discussed. Arthur looked at Claudette. Claudette looked back at him and said nothing, because this was not her moment to fill. We discussed no restructuring, Arthur said. The refrigerator hummed. Brigitte's expression did not collapse, not exactly, but something behind her eyes recalibrated. Arthur, we spoke about this last week, about streamlining. I said the garden service might be reduced in winter, Arthur said. That was the full extent of it. He looked at Claudette again. Are you all right? The question was so simple and so direct that it took Claudette a moment to locate her answer. She was 63 years old. She had raised 2 children in a rented house 20 minutes from this estate and had driven to work before the sun came up more mornings than she could count. She had held her composure through a husband's illness and her daughter's difficult years and 100 small defeats that no one in this house had ever seen. She was not accustomed to being asked if she was all right by someone who meant it. I'm fine, she said. Thank you, Arthur. Brigitte touched Arthur's arm. Can we talk in the sitting room? In a moment. He did not look at her. He was still watching Claudette, the way someone watches a person they have underestimated and are in the process of correcting. Claudette, I want to be clear. Your position here is not changing. Not while I'm in this house. The silver was warm in Claudette's hands. Thank you, she said again, quieter this time. Arthur gave a brief, satisfied nod and turned toward the hallway. Brigitte followed, and over her shoulder she sent Claudette a look so flat and precise it needed no translation at all. This is not finished, that look said. You've only delayed it. Claudette already knew. She had known before Brigitte's heels had cleared the kitchen doorway. Women like that did not stop, they revised. What Claudette did not know yet, what none of them knew in that moment, was that the thing Brigitte was most determined to bury was not Claudette's position in the house. It was what Claudette had seen 14 months ago, on a Tuesday evening in November, when she had come back to collect her reading glasses from the study, and found the drawer of Arthur's desk open, and a document sitting on top of it that should not have been there at all. She had not read it fully. She had seen enough. She had closed the drawer, collected her glasses and left the house without speaking to anyone, and she had said nothing. Not because she was afraid, though she was a little, but because she was not certain what she had seen, because she did not yet understand what it meant, because she was a woman who had learned, through 11 years and more than 11 years of life before that speaking without certainty only gives the wrong people time to prepare. She had waited. She was still waiting, but Brigitte Voss, in her white dress and her deliberate heels, had just made the waiting much harder to sustain. The end of that week brought Theodore Alderton home from Vancouver. Theodore was Arthur's younger son, 44 years old, and he had his father's gray eyes and almost none of his father's patience. He worked in commercial real estate, and he came home to the estate for long weekends, with the specific energy of someone who believed arrival itself was a kind of contribution. He kissed Brigitte in the foyer, shook Arthur's hand in the hall, and appeared in the kitchen on Saturday morning to make his own coffee, which Claudette had always understood was his way of signaling that he considered himself a regular person. Claudette. He was filling the kettle. You're in early. I'm always in early on Saturdays, Theodore. Right. He leaned against the counter and watched the kettle. Brigitte mentioned she spoke to you last week. Claudette continued unloading the dishwasher. She did. I want you to know that was her idea, not mine. He said it too quickly, the way people say things they have practiced. I would have done it differently. More notice, obviously. Proper severance. I know how long you've been here. Your father told me my position isn't changing. Theodore looked up. He did? He was in the kitchen when the conversation happened. Something shifted in Theodore's expression. Not guilt exactly, something more complicated. The look of a man who has agreed to a plan and is now discovering the plan had not accounted for the full geography of the house. He didn't mention that to me, Theodore said. No, said Claudette very evenly. I don't imagine he did. She finished with the dishwasher and straightened up, and she looked at Theodore Alderton with 11 years of knowledge behind her eyes. She had watched him grow into himself, watched him make decisions, watched him choose the easy version of situations when the honest version was available and he simply hadn't reached for it. She liked him. She had always liked him. In the limited way you like someone who is not bad, only incomplete. Theodore, she said carefully. Can I ask you something? Sure. The documents your father keeps in the study. Has he reviewed his estate plan recently? The kettle began to heat. Theodore's face did something she had not expected. It went still. The faces go still not from calm but from the recognition of a word that has been living in the back of the mind for some time. Why are you asking that? Claudette folded the tea towel in her hands. I came back one evening for my glasses 14 months ago. His desk drawer was open. I saw a document on top. Theodore said nothing. I didn't read it fully, she said. I saw enough to wonder whether the version of your father's will that you and your brother believe exists is the version that currently exists. The kettle clicked off. Neither of them moved toward it. Theodore's voice when it came was very quiet. What did you see? A draft, she said, with Bridget's name. The kitchen held that sentence for a long moment. Theodore set his mug down on the counter with a sound that was almost nothing, just the small click of ceramic on stone, but in that silence it was its own kind of statement. Have you told anyone? Why not? Claudette looked at him. Because I'm the housekeeper, Theodore. If I walk into a room and say I saw something in your father's desk, I'm a woman talking out of place about things that aren't her business. I needed to be certain, and I needed to not be the only one who knew. Theodore was quiet for a long time. He was not a man who processed quickly. He was a man who processed thoroughly, which sometimes looked the same and sometimes looked like nothing at all. She watched him arrive at whatever he was arriving at. There's a notary, he said finally, Marcus Cheng. My father's used him for 30 years. He'd know if anything's been changed. I think that's where I'd start, said Claudette. Theodore nodded slowly. Then he looked at her. And it was the first time that morning he looked at her without the slight distraction that men of his upbringing often brought to conversations with domestic staff, the way their attention was present but never fully anchored. You've been sitting on this for 14 months, he said. I have. That must have been. He stopped, reconsidered. Why didn't you leave? If you'd seen that and said nothing, you could have just left. Claudette unfolded the tea towel and refolded it. It was an old habit, something her hands did when her mind was deciding what to say. Because leaving would have felt like choosing myself over the people in this house who didn't know what I knew, and I wasn't raised to do that. Theodore said nothing for a moment. Then he said very simply, thank you. It was a small thing, but it was real, and Claudette received it as such. What happened over the following days was quiet in the way serious things are often quiet. No raised voices, no confrontations in hallways. Theodore made a phone call to Marcus Cheng on Monday. On Wednesday, Marcus came to the estate in the afternoon, and he and Theodore were in the study for 2 hours with the door closed. Claudette brought tea at the 1-hour mark, set it on the tray outside the door, and withdrew without being asked. She did not need to hear the conversation. She already knew the shape of it. What she had not anticipated was Brigitte. Brigitte Voss was not a woman who permitted the ground to shift under her without noticing. She had, Claudette would reflect later, an almost architectural instinct for structural change in the households she moved through. She had spent 2 years mapping the Alderton estate, learning its rhythms, learning who mattered and who could be moved. And she had learned it the way a person learns a house they intend to inherit. She knew something was different by Thursday. Claudette could see it in the way she moved through the rooms that day, quieter than usual, her eyes tracking small things, the closed study door, the tea tray outside it, the absence of Theodore's usual easy chatter at lunch. On Thursday evening, Brigitte came to find Claudette in the linen room. The linen room was narrow and smelled of cedar and pressed cotton. Claudette was folding fitted sheets, a task that required a specific kind of attention, and she was 2 sheets in when the door opened. Brigitte stepped inside and closed it behind her. She did not look the way she had looked in the kitchen last week. She looked, if anything, more controlled. The way people look more controlled when they are operating from a position of less certainty and they need no one to see it. I think we may have started off on the wrong foot, Brigitte said. Claudette reached for the next sheet. What makes you say that? The conversation I had with you last week was poorly handled, I realize that. She paused. I'd like to start over. Claudette folded the sheet with the particular precision of someone who has folded thousands of sheets and does not need to look at her hands to do it correctly. She said nothing. Brigitte continued. Theodore and I are getting married in April. That's going to mean changes in this house. I want to make sure that the people who've been here a long time feel respected in that transition. That's very considerate, said Claudette. Something about the evenness of it made Brigitte hesitate. I hope we can have an understanding. Claudette set the folded sheet on the shelf and looked at Brigitte Voss directly, for the first time in this conversation, with the full and unhurried attention of a woman who had decided she was done looking slightly to the side, an understanding about what Brigitte, about the fact that some conversations are private. Her voice remained smooth, but under the smoothness there was something with edges. That the things that happen in a household stay in a household. That's always been how a good house runs. There it was. Not quite a threat, not quite a request. The space in between, where women like Brigitte Voss were most comfortable. Claudette reached for the next sheet. Her hands were perfectly steady. She had been waiting 14 months for this conversation and she was not going to be rushed through it now. The things I've seen in this house, she said slowly, I've kept for 11 years, not because I was told to, because they weren't mine to share. She shook the sheet out and began the fold. The document I saw in Arthur's desk 14 months ago is a different matter. Brigitte's composure did not crack, but it narrowed, like a door closing down to the width of one careful eye. You don't know what you saw, I know what I saw, said Claudette. I didn't know what it meant until I said it out loud. To whom? It was not quite a question. The grammar of it was a question, but the tone was something else. Something that wanted to know the shape of what it was up against. Theodore knows I came back for my glasses that evening, Claudette said. He knows the desk drawer was open. He knows I saw a document. She placed the folded sheet on the shelf beside the first one. The rest is between him and Marcus Cheng. The name landed with precision. She watched it land. She watched Brigitte absorb the name of Arthur's notary and understand exactly what it meant. For 3 full seconds the linen room was completely silent. Then Brigitte said with a control so deliberate it was itself a kind of admission. You are making a serious mistake. No, said Claudette. She reached for the last sheet. I was making a serious mistake. Staying quiet about something I should have said sooner, because I was afraid of what happened to people in my position when they said difficult things. That was the mistake. She shook the sheet out. I'm correcting it now. Brigitte left the linen room without another word. She did not slam the door. She closed it very precisely, which was somehow worse. Claudette stood in the cedar and cotton air and finished folding the sheet. Her hands did not shake. She noticed that. Her hands did not shake. That Friday afternoon Arthur Alderton asked to see Claudette in the sitting room. She found him in the armchair by the window with a manila envelope on the table beside him, and the expression of a man who has spent the last 48 hours doing something that cost him greatly. His eyes were tired. His hands rested on his knees with the particular stillness of hands that have had a long week. Claudette sat across from him. She was that kind of afternoon and they both knew it. Marcus came Wednesday, Arthur said. I know. I didn't ask him to. Theodore did. He looked at his hands, but I'm glad he did. Claudette said nothing. This was Arthur Alderton's turn. The document you saw. He paused. There were changes I'd been persuaded to make. Last spring. I was told they were sensible. Tax efficiencies. I trusted the person advising me. He did not say Brigitte's name. He did not need to. Marcus showed me what those changes actually meant. Practically. For Theodore, for my elder son Graham, for the family trust. He looked up. For anyone connected to me who wasn't Brigitte Voss. Claudette held his gaze and said nothing. You saw this 14 months ago, he said. I saw enough of it. Why didn't you come to me? This was the question she had asked herself 14 months of Tuesday evenings. She had prepared an answer. She had prepared several. But in that sitting room in the afternoon light, she found herself setting all of them aside and saying the true one. Because I was afraid you'd believe her over me. And I was afraid that even if you didn't, the telling of it would end my time here in a way that the staying quiet wouldn't. She paused. I was protecting myself. I'm not proud of that. Arthur looked at her for a long moment. Then he said, I would have believed you. I know that now. I should have made that clearer over the years. She almost smiled. That's a kind thing to say. It's an honest thing. He reached for the manila envelope, then seemed to change his mind and left it where it was. Brigitte is leaving today. She doesn't know I know the full scope of it, what she had prepared, what she and her solicitor had arranged in advance of the wedding. Marcus was very thorough. Claudette remembered the Tuesday evening, the drawer open, the paper angled toward the light. The particular document she had seen was a preliminary version. She understood now. The final architecture had been considerably more elaborate. I'm sorry, she said. I know you cared about her. Arthur looked toward the window. The afternoon was gray, the particular gray of Ontario in late October, that specific overcast that is not quite rain and not quite clear and sits over the landscape like something unresolved. I was lonely, he said very simply. That's the truth of it. After Eleanor died I was lonely and someone noticed and I was grateful for the attention. That's a very old story. It is, Claudette agreed. It doesn't make it hurt less. He turned back to look at her. No, it doesn't. He picked up the envelope now and held it. There's something else. Marcus found a discrepancy while he was reviewing the records, something that predates Brigitte by a long time. He paused. It relates to a trust my father established, for a family member I was told had no surviving relatives. Claudette waited. My father had a son, Arthur said, before my mother, before any of us. A son who was placed for adoption in 1951 and whose records were sealed. He set the envelope on the table between them. The trust was set up to benefit that child's descendants. It was never dissolved, it was simply not talked about. The room became very quiet. Marcus found the name. Arthur continued. The descendant in question would be in her mid-50s now. She's been living in this province for 30 years. He looked at Claudette with those tired gray eyes. Her name is Dorothy Marsh. The air in the sitting room seemed to take on weight. Claudette's voice when it came was not quite her usual voice. It was several years younger and a great deal more unsteady. Dorothy Marsh is my mother. Arthur nodded slowly. I know. She looked at the envelope on the table between them. Her mother was 78 years old and lived in a small house in Kingston and called every Sunday, and had never once in Claudette's memory spoken about her father or the family she came from. Only that she had been placed with a family as an infant. Only that she had been loved, in the way that became its own country, separate from the country of origin that was never shown on any map. She doesn't know? Claudette said. No. I only confirmed it this week, and the trust is valid. Has been accumulating for 70 years. Arthur folded his hands over his knees again. Marcus will explain the full details, it is significant. Claudette sat with that. 70 years of a number growing in silence while her mother called every Sunday and grew her garden, and asked Claudette how the family she worked for were getting on. Not knowing, never knowing, that the family she worked for had a specific, particular, documented connection to the woman who had borne her. I came to work here by accident, Claudette said. It came out barely above a whisper. I answered an ad in the paper. Eleanor had put it in because the previous housekeeper had retired. I know, said Arthur, and something in his face was very soft, very old. I've been thinking about that a great deal this week, whether there's such a thing as accident, or whether there's just the shape of things that we don't see until we're standing somewhere particular. Looking back. Claudette looked at her hands, the hands that had polished the silver on 11 years of third Sundays, the hands that had dressed the table and pressed the linen and learned the cold bones of this house and kept its confidences, and finally said one careful thing out loud to the right person at the right time. I need to call my mother, she said. Of course. She stood. Then she stopped. She looked at Arthur Alderton, who was nobody's grandfather and yet was, it turned out, something adjacent to family, in the way that facts rearrange themselves into shapes you can only recognize after the arrangement is complete. The document Brigitte brought to you, Claudette said. The changes to the estate plan. Did she know about my mother's family connection? Arthur was quiet for a moment. We believe so. Marcus found correspondence between her and her solicitor from 8 months ago that references the trust and a potential claim against it. We think identifying the heir and neutralizing any household staff who might discover the connection was part of a longer plan. The linen room. The Tuesday evening in November. Brigitte's very specific interest, from the very beginning, in the position of the housekeeper who had been there the longest. She tried to remove me twice, Claudette said. The first time quietly last year. I didn't understand it then. No, said Arthur. You wouldn't have. They looked at each other across the sitting room with its afternoon gray light and its familiar furniture, and the weight of what 11 years had contained without their knowing. I'm sorry, Arthur said. For all of it. For the original silence, for my father's silence. For the ways this family buried what it should have acknowledged a long time ago. Claudette thought of her mother's voice on Sunday mornings. The specific way she said how are the Aldertons, love. As if they were simply the nice family her daughter worked for. Not family that had carried her own blood for a generation without ever turning to face it. Saying sorry doesn't undo it, Claudette said. Then, because she had her mother's discipline about the truth, and her mother's discipline about grace. But it's a place to start. She called her mother from the kitchen, standing at the window looking out at the gray October garden, and she did not say everything on the phone, because some things should not be said on the phone, but she said enough. Dorothy Marsh listened the way she always listened, without interruption, and then she was quiet for a long time. And then she said, in the voice of a woman who had carried an unanswered question for 78 years without ever letting it make her bitter, I always wondered if there was a reason. There was, said Claudette. There, well, her mother said. And then after a pause that held a whole life in it, I suppose I should come for a visit. Brigitte Voss left the Alderton estate on a Friday afternoon with her luggage loaded into a car that was not Arthur's and her face composed in the precise, brittle way of a person conserving what remains of their resources for whatever comes next. She did not say goodbye to Claudette. She looked at her, once as she crossed the front hall, and what was in that look was not hatred, though it might have been easier if it were. What was in it was the particular acknowledgement that passes between two people who understand. Finally, the exact shape of what has occurred between them. Brigitte Voss had tried to move Claudette Marsh out of a house that, it turned out, she had more claim to than anyone had known, and it had been Claudette's stillness, her refusal to be managed, her 11 years of careful witnessing, that had undone the whole architecture. The car drove down the long gravel road and turned out of sight, and Claudette stood at the front window and watched it go. Theodore appeared behind her. He had said very little since Wednesday, processing in the way she had always known him to process, thoroughly and out of view. Are you all right? He asked. It was, she reflected, the second time someone in this house had asked her that in a single week. She was perhaps overdue. I'm going to bring my mother to meet your father, she said. When she's ready. When he's ready. Theodore nodded. He stood beside her at the window, looking at the empty drive. I didn't know about any of it. I know you didn't. I should have paid closer attention. He paused. To a lot of things. Yes, said Claudette, because she was not in the business of offering comfort that hadn't been earned. You should have. He accepted that. She had always respected that about him, when he had the discipline for it. Dorothy Marsh arrived 3 weeks later, on a Saturday in November, in her good coat and her practical shoes, carrying the small loaf of apple bread she brought to every house she visited, because she believed, as she had always believed, that you came to a person's house with something in your hands and gratitude in your posture. And you conducted yourself accordingly regardless of what you were about to learn about the shape of your own life. Arthur Alderton met her at the door. They were the same generation. This old man and this old woman. And they stood in the doorway of the house that held the intersection of their histories, and they looked at each other the way people look when they are locating in a stranger's face, something that has always been faintly familiar without ever having had a name. Mrs. Marsh, Arthur said. Mr. Alderton, Dorothy said. Then, because she was her mother's daughter and her daughter's mother and she had earned her own particular kind of clarity. Your father was a complicated man, I expect. He was, Arthur said. I'm sorry for what was kept from you. Dorothy looked at him for a long moment with Claudette's gray-brown eyes, with the precise steadiness that Claudette had always believed was simply her mother's character, and now understood was something older, something carried in the family she had never been told she had. Apologies are a beginning, Dorothy said, and stepped inside. Claudette stood in the hallway behind them, the apple bread in her hands still warm from the drive, and she thought about 11 years and Tuesday evenings, and the specific color of light that falls through a kitchen window in early morning when the house is quiet and the work is honest, and the truth is still waiting, very patiently, for the moment it can finally be said aloud. She had been told, once by a woman she had worked for long before the Aldertons, that a good housekeeper knew when to act and when to wait, and that knowing the difference was everything. At the time Claudette had taken it as practical instruction, a rhythm of work, a discipline of service. Standing in the hall of the Alderton house, watching her mother and an old man walk together toward the sitting room where two different silences were finally preparing to end, she understood it differently. Waiting was not the absence of action. It was its own kind of holding, keeping something safe until the house was ready to hear it, until the right person had come back for their reading glasses, or looked a little too long at an open drawer, or simply refused very quietly to move. Some truths need a keeper before they can find their way home. Claudette Marsh had been keeping this one for 11 years. And the house at last was ready.